about this Messiah figure. So Messiah is the Hebrew word, the Greek word is Christ, and so that's just the same word, the Messiah, Christ, if you hear that. And I want to look at the period before Jesus, where he's promised. I want to look at Jesus himself coming, where the Messiah is provided, and then also the period afterwards. And really, the focus of this talk, which has generally been the focus of this first day of the week, is really on evidence. Is there evidence to believe that this is true? So we're not going to get into a lot of the content of what Jesus taught. We'll do that later in the week. But it's really about, is there evidence to make this believable, plausible, maybe even the most plausible option. So let's start off then with Messiah promise. So there's a lot which is promised about the Messiah before he comes. I've got some things on the screen there. It was promised that the Messiah was going to be born in Bethlehem, born to a virgin, born in the royal line of David. He was going to heal the sick, ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. He would be rejected by his own people, that he would be mocked but remain silent, that he would be pierced but none of his bones broken, that he would die 483 years after the command to rebuild Jerusalem, pretty specific, that he would die for the sin of his people, and that he would rise again on the third day. Now, I've put there the date approximately that those promises were given, and then the fulfillment. And as a skeptic, you're probably rightly thinking through, okay, how do I explain these things away? And perhaps there's two main ways you might try and explain it away. So the first thing you might say is, well, these promises, or we might say prophecies, they were not given when you said they were given. There's no way. They must have been corrupted and altered later on. They were probably written after the time of Jesus. So that might be one thing you'd say. And the other thing you might say is, well, actually, there's nothing wrong with the prophecies, but Jesus and his followers purposefully orchestrated events, or perhaps even rewrote them and lied about them in such a way that these things came to be fulfilled. Okay, so have a think, in your own mind now. Maybe you particularly align with one of those two, or maybe both of those skepticisms. But actually, the first one, the idea that this was written later, it was corrupted,
really is not a plausible position anymore. So I want you to cast your mind back, let's say 200 years ago, as modern archaeology is not really a thing yet, it's kind of coming in. And imagine you are a religious person. How do you feel about archaeology becoming more popular? You might be thinking, well, this is quite scary, because what on earth are we going to dig up and find? Is this going to completely debunk my religion? And I would even go so far as to say that has been the case for some religions. Or you might be thinking, well, could this be true? Could we find evidence that actually points towards this being true? And it's a really interesting thing that we now have archaeology, we now have manuscripts that tell us so much, that give us so much in the way of evidence. And one of the most significant pieces of manuscript evidence that we have is the Dead Sea Scrolls. So probably a lot of you have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they date back to between 250 and 68 BC. And what's the important thing about those dates? Everyone agrees that the Dead Sea Scrolls were definitely written before the time of Jesus. Now, what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, they contain fragments from every book in the Jewish Old Testament. That's all of the books of the Bible before Jesus, except from one, which is the book of Esther. And they include an almost complete copy of some of those, of Isaiah in particular, which is one of the main big prophecy books. You saw it in that list on the previous slide, mentioned in a few places. So this is absolutely stunning, because it means that that first idea that, well, it was corrupted later is completely out. Because when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you compare them to the manuscripts that we have, the other manuscripts that we have and that we use today, they are the same. The differences that exist between the manuscripts are minor differences in words here and there, and stylistic differences. Maybe the ordering of words has been flipped around in a couple of places, but the meaning is the same, and pretty much the entire thing is exactly the same. And certainly there is no evidence that any of these small manuscript differences in any way were specifically created by someone with an intention to deceive or to add in a Messiah figure later on. There's absolutely no evidence for this. And so it really is very, very stunning that this theory that it was corrupted, that it was written later, is out the water, right? Because even if you said, well, okay, so you're saying Isaiah was written 700 BC, then maybe it was corrupted between 700 BC and 200 BC, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. And I could say, well, fine, let's just assume that that's true. I don't think it is true, but suppose it's true. It still stands that this was written before the time of Jesus. And so there's something miraculous that has taken place. So then it leads you to have to go with that second option, that Jesus and his followers purposefully orchestrated events or rewrote them such that these things came to pass. So there's a lot of things on the list there. If you want, you could take a picture of that and have a look into it, because I think it's really good to research these things. Or you can come and find me afterwards, I can give you the slide. But in particular, I want to look at some of those highlighted ones that are all mentioned in one particular passage, Isaiah 53. And this is very well preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is great. We've got the whole chapter, so we've got a lot of confidence there. And I'm just going to read this through. And you may not know a lot about Jesus. That's okay, but the more you find out about Jesus, and hopefully the more you find out this week, hopefully the more you'll see just how stunning this prophecy really is. So let's read it. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities, and the punishment that brought us peace was on him. So straight away, the idea that he was pierced for our transgressions, we see the fulfillment in Jesus after he's come off the cross, being pierced with a spear into his side by the soldiers, just to make sure absolutely that he was dead. And then we go on, later on it talks about him being led. So this is in verse 7 near the bottom on the left. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And again, you see in such a bizarre scene, Jesus, as he's going into the court scene before his death, he remains silent throughout the entire occasion. He's cut off from the land of the living. He's assigned a grave with the rich. He had done no violence. His life is given as an offering for sin. And then after he suffers, he sees the light of life. So he dies, and then he comes back to life. Now, let's ask the question, is it possible that Jesus and his disciples could have orchestrated events to bring these things about? Well, on some of them, you could say, maybe. So the idea that he'd done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Maybe Jesus just really tried hard at being a good guy, and if he did do anything wrong, he just made sure it was behind closed doors. Okay. Cut off from the land of the living, so he's going to be determined to die, and that's certainly something that we see. Not opening his mouth before the court, okay, you can see that. But what about pierced for our transgressions? Jesus has no control over the manner in which he's killed, and certainly what happens to him after he's been killed. And of course, critically, what about seeing the light of life after he has suffered? And so it really only leads us with one final objection, which is this must have been rewritten by the disciples. That this can't have happened. It can't be that this was promised hundreds of years in advance, and it took place exactly like this. Remember, this is only one prophecy among many that I mentioned earlier. Jesus couldn't possibly have made sure that these things actually happened. And so maybe it's the case that it's actually rewritten by the disciples. And that leads us nicely onto the Messiah proclaimed. We'll come back to Messiah provided. But it leads us nicely onto that, because we need to zoom in on these disciples and say, is it reasonable to say that the disciples changed the story? Would they have had the ability to do that? Would they have been successful? Would they have had a motive to do that? So I want to zoom in on that question. Messiah proclaimed. So after the time of Jesus, how is it that you go from a guy who is a carpenter, not of any particular significance, in a backwash town, Nazareth, how does it go from him dying 2,000 years ago to a worldwide religion that billions of people have got on board with from nations all over the world? How did that happen? Well, okay, so it starts off from these followers of Jesus. Okay, so we know that he has 12 disciples in particular, and he has other followers as well. What were they like? Well, at least in the accounts that we have of Jesus' life, the disciples are portrayed as weak, as failing, as quite pathetic. And ultimately, when Jesus goes to the cross, most of them desert him entirely. They're scattered like sheep. And so they're not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead. Even though he said he's going to rise from the dead, the disciples aren't expecting it. They're distraught. They don't know what to do with themselves. And they're not bold people, okay? So is it credible to say that they then went from that position to then being so sure that Jesus rose from the dead that they were actually willing to die for it? And on this theory, we're also saying that not only were they claiming Jesus rose from the dead, but they would have had to have rewritten numerous elements of the story to make them fit these Old Testament prophecies, right? So is this reasonable? And I think there's a couple of reasons why this isn't reasonable. The first one is that the disciples were not in the state of mind to do that when Jesus died. You can see the way in which they're scattered, the way in which they're distraught. They're not acting as charismatic leaders ready to turn things around. But then the other thing is there anyone that you can think of in history who's been willing to die for something they know for a fact is a lie? I mean, there's people that die for all kinds of things, and it takes a certain type of person to die for what they believe in, and there maybe aren't a lot of people who will do that, but to die for something you don't believe in, for something you know is a lie, I can't think of anyone who would do that. But then, even on another level, if there was going to be someone who would die for a lie, it wouldn't be the disciples. Not just because they're pathetic, but also because Jesus has specifically commanded them not to lie. So this is what Jesus says in Matthew 5. Simply let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything more comes from the evil one. So if their if their teacher had specifically told them not to lie, why on earth would they go directly against his teaching to claim that he was actually risen from the dead, that he was actually pierced with a spear, that he was actually born in Bethlehem, that he was actually killed at exactly the right time, that he, etc., etc. Why would they lie about all of those things when he specifically commanded them not to lie, and when they knew that they were going to be killed for those lies? The whole thing just doesn't add up. And so we see both with Messiah promised and Messiah proclaimed that there does seem to be strong evidence that actually the Christian faith is based on. And again, we're not really getting into the content of the Christian message a lot in this talk, but I'm really trying to persuade you as we go through the rest of the week that there's something here that is actually historically grounded. We know when these manuscripts are written, and we know that there's a massive question that if you're not a Christian, you're going to have to find some way of answering. And then just very briefly, finally, there's Messiah provided. And so you might be asking, well, what's the evidence that Jesus really was this great Messiah figure. And there's loads of different things I could say. This is maybe a bit of a niche piece of evidence to bring, but I think it's quite compelling. Think about the one-liners of Jesus. Okay, so I've got some up on the screen there. Maybe I'll just read a couple of them out. Whoever wants to be first must be the slave of all. Or if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. We hear that a lot, don't we? Turn the other cheek. Many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Jesus has got some fantastic one-liners, and I think we appreciate them less because we're built out of a culture that is Christianized. But if you look at the surrounding cultures at this time, and even the Jewish culture, so many of these one-liners are completely new. You haven't seen anything like it before. The idea that you would turn the other cheek to your enemy and love your enemy is new. No one's been saying these things before. And so even if you think, well, I don't think Jesus actually said all of those things, how can we find evidence that he did? Then what you're really saying is you think someone later on was one of the greatest literary geniuses in history in writing these things and pretending that Jesus actually said them. I mean, think about how many great quotes there are from Shakespeare, and yet the number of fantastic quotes from Jesus far outweighs even Shakespeare, and yet there's so much more writing from Shakespeare than there is in the Gospels. And so you have to try and come to a belief about where these one-liners come from. You know, even if it wasn't Jesus who said them, how could this group of disciples or whoever it was come up with so many of these great teachings in such a crystallized form? And again, manuscript evidence is really on our side, because you can't say that these were written a long time afterwards, because we have early manuscripts of the Gospels. These are the biographies of Jesus' life, dating back to within a small number of generations of the events themselves. And so it's not as if culture had moved on by hundreds of years at the point at which we get to the early manuscripts. So again, I'm really trying to encourage you to think, what is your theory for how there can be so much apparent evidence for Jesus being the Messiah in history? And so just as we close, I want you to really go away and think carefully, you know, as university students, what is my view of history and how Jesus fits into it? Why did he have such a profound impact on history? And I think, to be intellectually honest, you have to open yourself up as you begin to the possibility that he might be who he says he is. You know, if you start off with a premise, there is no God, and then you do some research and you come to the conclusion there is no God, you haven't proved anything, because it was already in your premise. So open up your mind to all the options and say, what is the historical evidence pointing me towards? It's not the only thing to look at, but it's important. And where's the best place to look for historical evidence? Well, the best place to look is to look at the accounts written of Jesus' life. And that's what you've got on your tables. You see these things called Uncover Luke. These are the biographies of Jesus' life that were written within 40 years of his death. And we've even got manuscripts dating back to not long after that period. And so the best thing you could do, you could look at external evidence and so on and so forth. But historically speaking, the best thing to do is to start with these manuscripts themselves. And why not find a Christian in the room that you could actually read one of these with? I, at university, was able to read these with a great number of people. And it was incredible seeing people's minds completely change, realizing that actually there is great evidence for these things, but not just evidence, but evidence that is compelling to change your life on the basis of what you find there, that this is not only an intellectual theory. And so as I close, let me just say on Messiah Provided, Jesus did have these great one-liners. He had great teaching, and he set a perfect example. But ultimately, Jesus had one main mission, and it wasn't that. It wasn't his great teaching, and it wasn't his perfect example. His main mission was to die, which is a crazy thing for a leader to do throughout his whole time as a leader, to be so keen to die. And yet this is exactly what Jesus did. Now, why did Jesus come to die? Well, that's something that you need to come back later in the week. On Friday at 1:30, I'm really going to be diving into that question. Why is God on a cross? Why was Jesus so keen to die? We've looked at the evidence today that he was who he says he was, but what does that actually mean for you? Why was he so keen to die on a cross? So come back later in the week and come and chat to me more about what that is like. But I'll hand over now, and we're going to have some time for Q&A, so looking forward to your questions. Thanks very much.
Yeah, so as Josh said, we're going to go into a bit of a Q&A. We're going to have a slider, which basically is, if you want to scan, there will be a QR code on the screens. If you want to scan that and submit a question, but also if you want to just grab a mic and do it, that's fine as well. We'll give you 2 minutes to discuss that. Thank you.
Hello. So just a quick explanation of now. So we're going to ask Josh a question or two. However, Josh is very happy after he's answered the questions that if the person who asked the question or anyone else has almost a follow-up question, that we'll run the mic over to them and they can ask that to him directly, so that if there's potentially something more you want to add, that he can then answer that immediately for you. And so for the first question, we're going to go with, if the only evidence for the Old Testament, we have for the Old Testament, historically, is an incomplete Dead Sea Scrolls, how do we know what else is missed?
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I think we'll put that together with, there was another question about the book of Esther as well. If the book of Esther's not in there, how do we know that's legit? So this is a great question. So let's start off with why have the whole Old Testament and not less, and then we'll go on to why not have more. So why not have less? Well, okay, so we have a lot more manuscripts than just the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're just saying that the Dead Sea Scrolls are some of the earliest manuscripts that we have, okay? So we have manuscripts of Esther, we have manuscripts of everything, but the dates of the earliest manuscripts might be different for different parts. Now, if you find, as is the case in the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of manuscript evidence that aligns perfectly with what we have today, then is it not logical to think that the other parts of the Old Testament that may not be in the Dead Sea Scrolls were also not corrupted in that same time period. Because everything that you do have available, you don't have everything, but everything that you do have available, all the fragments that have survived, and it's a miracle really for any fragments to survive, they are giving the same message that we have today. And the great thing is that the fragments that we do have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they contain all of the key messianic texts. So what I mean by that is promises and prophecies about this Messiah figure. Esther's not one of those books particularly. And so even if you said, well, maybe there's some of the things that are not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, maybe they were corrupted and changed before the time of, or after the time of Jesus, but before the time of the earliest manuscripts of Esther. Well, Esther's not particularly talking about Jesus. It's not really one of the books that's giving messianic prophecy. So there wouldn't really be an incentive to change it. So that's kind of an argument for everything that's in the Old Testament being valid. And, we can say that it was the accepted Jewish text that they used in that time. And then why not have more? I think that's really on the same point, that there was a consensus about what was in the Jewish Old Testament. It was what was translated in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation they had of the Old Testament. And so there are other texts that are in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are not in the Old Testament. There's a whole range of things in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But you can even see in some of those texts that the texts themselves are not claiming for themselves to be the Word of God. It's a collection of Jewish writings and things that they used at the time. And so you have to look at what, in history, what are the texts that the Jews were using at that time. And yeah, I think there is a consensus really that these were some of the texts that they were particularly using. But yeah, do come and chat to me more about that point afterwards as well, if you've asked that question. Do people want to add more onto that now? With the caveat that I'm not an Old Testament scholar.
If there's no more on that, we'll move on to the next question. So, one that's been liked quite a few times. How do I know that the Messiah you're talking about is meant for me? And from what you've explained, it seems tied to the Jewish historical context. This also kind of links into another one about why do we privilege the history of Israel in the Old Testament rather than other ones. So, kind of the Jewish focus, I suppose, is a theme there.
Yeah. So, Jesus tells a parable about the kingdom of God where it's like a mustard seed. And so it starts off small, and you kind of see that before the time of Jesus, the people of God is largely speaking the Jewish nation. There are some people outside that are brought in, but not many, a handful. And then, after the time of Jesus, it booms out like a tree to all the nations. And there's actually a command for Christians to spread the good news of Jesus to all the nations in the world. So, in terms of, for me, what relevance does the Messiah have to me? Well, the good news has now been opened up to the whole world. And the good news is that anyone who repents of the wrong that they've done, says sorry for it, and I want to live a new life now, and puts their faith in Jesus, can be forgiven for all that they've done and have a relationship with God. And that's been opened up to all people, not just the Jews. So the Messiah, he's connected to the Jewish nation because he comes from the Jewish nation. But actually, the coming of the Messiah is the very event which takes the good news from the Jews to the whole world. So actually, the Messiah coming is great for you guys because I'm not a Jew, and yet because the Messiah came, the good news reached me, and I've become a Christian, and the same could be true for you as well.
Cool. Does anyone have any follow-up questions for Josh that have sprung to mind as he's answered that? Or shall we move on? So there's quite a connected question that people seem to be quite interested in, who have asked, what about where we see God in the history of other nations, not just the Jewish nation?
This is a good plug for my talk tomorrow. So we're going to be looking at where is God in all the religions tomorrow. And there's one really important question to answer there, which is, why is it that God specifically focuses on the Jewish nation in the Old Testament and not a lot of the other nations? What about where we see God in the history of other nations? Yeah, I mean, come back tomorrow. We're going to talk more about it. I'm not going to spoil it.
If anyone's got a follow-up of that, tomorrow. Yeah. We'll do another one. So, the question saying, what do you believe to be the most convincing Old Testament prophecy with regards to Jesus?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is the plethora of Old Testament prophecies, it really adds credibility the more that you have. I think any one of them on their own would be absolutely remarkable. But when you start piling them up, then it really does become truly remarkable. And so it's hard to say that one is particularly, amazing over and above the others. But maybe just to pull one out for an example, Jesus is raised in Nazareth, okay? And he's from Nazareth, but then he's actually born in Bethlehem. And it's really interesting because it's predicted that the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. But then there's one point where the religious leaders of the day, they're so angry with Jesus getting so much crowd attention, and they want to put an end to it. And they say, don't you know that the Messiah is not from Nazareth? Nothing good comes out of Nazareth. And so the very thing that they're so adamant about, they know that it couldn't be from Nazareth. Actually, it was specifically promised that he would be from Bethlehem, not from Nazareth. They were right. But then Jesus is actually born in Bethlehem. And so there's so many different prophecies, but even the ones that people try to say, oh, Jesus can't be the Messiah because of this, it actually turns out those are the very things which point towards him being the Messiah.
Cool. Yeah, does anyone, again, any follow-up questions, or should we move on to our final question of this evening? So we're just going to ask you, what is the connection between the world being messed up and the Messiah? What is the relevance of the Messiah to this problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you for that, because I didn't really explain that. What is our biggest problem? Is it that there's suffering out there, or is it that I actually have a problem inside? That I do wrong things, and sometimes I don't even want to do the things that I do, but I do them anyway. And so there's actually a heart problem, and this is, I think, the biggest cause of suffering in the world. There's, as we've said, there is suffering that's not directly caused by humans. But if you were to name for me some of the greatest atrocities that you can think of, the greatest causes of suffering, you'd probably think of things that were caused by humans, whether it be wars or something like that. So the biggest problem is inside, and the Messiah deals with that problem. Jesus deals with that problem in his first coming by saying, if you come to me, even in your brokenness, I will give you a new heart. So I'll replace your wicked heart and give you a new one. So I'm going to save you from the old self that you have and give you a new self. And that is what Christianity is, that we're forgiven for what we've done and we're given a new heart. I'm not saying that Christians are perfect yet, but they are given a new heart that wants to do what's right, and that ultimately one day, in the new heaven and the new earth, will do perfectly what is right. And that is the second coming of Jesus. So at that point, then all suffering will be brought to an end. There will be no more sorrow or death or crying or pain, for the old order of things will pass away. And so in his first coming, he's really dealing with this heart problem that we have, offering a solution. And then in his second coming, which is the end of the earth as we know it, he's actually bringing a full end to suffering. And he's having a people with a new heart, so that in the new heaven and the new earth, when God has a people for himself, we're not going to go back and have more suffering that's caused by human beings messing up, because people are given a new heart so that things are then perfect and suffering is over.
Thank you for that and explaining how important the Messiah is to us. And once again, thank you for the talk tonight. I think we're just going to have a QR code come up now. We would really appreciate feedback about the event. And so if just, could everyone just take a couple of minutes just to fill this out, and so we know how to, just any thoughts and improvements that perhaps we could do for next time, that would be greatly appreciated.